Have you ever felt like there's a part of you kind of hidden just below the surface, a side that you don't want the world to see?
Hmm. It's a question that really gets to the core of who we are, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That feeling of having hidden depths. It's something that so many of us can relate to, for sure.
Absolutely. And today we are going to dive deep into this idea, this concept that explores this hidden aspect of our personalities, the shadow self.
The shadow self.
Yeah, and it was a term that was coined by the famous psychologist Carl Jung. And we're going to unpack how understanding this shadow can really help us unlock incredible potential in our lives. Our deep dive today is based on a transcript from the Quantum Soul channel.
Okay.
And it explores some pretty fascinating ideas like identity shifting and the power of vulnerability.
You know, what's really interesting about this source is that it doesn't shy away from the more challenging aspects of self-discovery.
Right.
You know, it acknowledges that true growth often requires us to confront those parts of ourselves that we'd rather keep hidden.
Right, and sometimes those hidden parts can feel pretty intimidating. So where do we even begin with this whole shadow self idea? The source mentions something called the 4 main archetypes. Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jung believed that our personalities are shaped by these 4 main archetypes. And they are the persona, the anima animus, the hero, and of course, the shadow.
Okay.
So the persona is basically the mask we wear for the world. It's the image that we present to others. Think of it as like your public persona, how you want people to perceive you.
So it's kind of like our social media profile, just that carefully curated version of ourselves that we kind of show to the world.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got the anima and animus. And these actually represent the feminine and masculine energies that exist within each of us, regardless of our gender.
So even though those terms might sound kind of mystical or esoteric, it's really about acknowledging that we all have both masculine and feminine qualities.
Precisely. And these energies actually play a huge role in our relationships, our creativity, and our overall sense of balance.
I'm starting to see how these archetypes are all interconnected. So what about the hero? I feel like that one's a bit more straightforward.
Yeah, I think the hero archetype is often the one that we most readily identify with. It's that part of us that strives for achievement. It seeks to overcome challenges and make a mark on the world. It's that part of us that wants to be successful, to be recognized, to be admired.
So the hero is all about striving for greatness, for reaching our full potential.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Jung believed that true power doesn't come solely from our heroic side. In fact, he argued that focusing solely on the hero can actually lead us to suppress our shadow.
Okay, so tell us more about this shadow archetype. It sounds like it might be the key to unlocking all this hidden potential we've been talking about.
Absolutely. So the shadow is the archetype that hold all the parts of ourselves that we deem unacceptable, undesirable, or even quote-unquote evil.
Okay.
It's the repository for our fears, our insecurities, our repressed desires, and our negative thoughts and feelings.
So it's kind of like the dark side of our personality, the stuff we don't want to admit we have.
Yes, but it's crucial to remember that the shadow isn't inherently bad or evil.
Right.
It's simply a part of us, just like the persona, the anima animus, and the hero. And according to Jung, the more we try to suppress or deny our shadow, the more power it has over us.
That makes sense. It's like if you try to push something down, it just comes back up with even more force.
Exactly. The source uses this great analogy to explain this.
Okay.
It talks about how our conscious mind is like the tip of an iceberg,
Oh, okay.
while our unconscious mind is the vast hidden mass that's beneath the surface. And the shadow, it resides in that unconscious realm, and it influences our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in ways we might not even be aware of.
So it's not just about our thoughts and feelings, it's also about our actions. How does the shadow actually play out in our everyday lives?
Well, Source explains that the shadow can manifest in many ways, both positive and negative. For example, that competitive drive that we often associate with success can actually be a shadow manifestation.
So even qualities that are generally seen as positive can have a shadow aspect.
Absolutely. The key is to understand how those qualities are being driven and whether they're aligned with our authentic selves.
Okay, so how do we even begin to understand something as complex and potentially scary as our shadow?
Right. Well, that's where this concept of individuation comes in, and the source actually describes this as the process of integrating all parts of ourselves, including the shadow.
Right.
It's about becoming a whole, complete person by acknowledging and accepting every aspect of who we are.
It sounds like a pretty intense journey. So if we want to embark on this path of individuation, how do we even start to make sense of what's happening in our unconscious minds? We're only consciously aware of a very small fraction of what's going on in there.
Yeah, that's right. The source points out that our conscious mind, that part we use for everyday thinking and decision making, is only about 5% of our total being. Just below that is the subconscious mind, which makes up another 5%. So that's only 10% accounted for. The other 90% is what's known as the personal and collective unconscious.
Wow, that's a huge part of ourselves that we're mostly unaware of.
Exactly. And it's within this unconscious realm, particularly the personal unconscious, where we find the shadow. The source explains that the personal unconscious reflects any deficits in our conscious selves. It's constantly trying to balance things out to bring us back to a state of wholeness.
So it's like our unconscious mind is trying to communicate with us to guide us towards becoming more complete.
Precisely. But the problem is most people just aren't aware of what's happening in their unconscious.
Okay.
They can't follow their intuition because they're constantly suppressing those shadow aspects.
Right.
And that can lead to a kind of inner explosion down the line.
That's a pretty powerful image. It sounds like ignoring our shadow can have some serious consequences.
Absolutely.
So how do we avoid that kind of inner explosion? How do we start to integrate those shadow aspects in a healthy way?
Well, that's where the work gets really interesting, and it's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. So we've established that ignoring our shadow can actually lead to some pretty intense internal conflict, even a kind of inner explosion, like the source puts it.
Right, an inner explosion.
But how do we start to integrate those shadow aspects, in a healthy way? Well, the source suggests this really fascinating concept called identity shifting.
Identity shifting?
Yeah, and this is where things start to get really practical.
Okay, identity shifting. I've heard that term before, but I'm not totally sure I understand what it means. Is it like trying to become someone else entirely?
That's a great question, and it's something the source addresses directly.
Okay.
It's not about changing who you are at your core, but more about aligning your actions with your authentic self. Think of it this way. We often pursue goals and live our lives based on what we think we should be doing, what society expects of us, rather than what truly resonates with our core being.
I can definitely relate to that. Sometimes it feels like I'm living out a script that someone else wrote, trying to fit into a mold that doesn't quite feel right.
Exactly. And that's where identity shifting comes in.
Yeah.
The source uses this really simple but powerful analogy.
Yeah, okay.
Being, doing, and having.
Being, doing, and having.
Right. They argue that you need to be who you truly are in order to do what you were meant to do, which then allows you to have what you truly desire.
I like that. It's a really clear way to think about it. So it's not about denying those shadow aspects, but more about understanding how they fit into the bigger picture of who we are and what we want to achieve, right?
Yeah, precisely. The source even shares a personal story, about breaking free from those societal expectations and finding both financial freedom and personal fulfillment by embracing his authentic identity. He realized that his goals weren't truly aligned with his values and desires. And by shifting his identity to align with his true self, he was able to achieve a level of success that had previously eluded him.
That's so inspiring. It really highlights how powerful it can be to align your actions with your authentic self. But how do we actually make that shift? It's one thing to understand the concept intellectually, but it's a whole other thing to actually put it into practice.
Right. That's where the rubber meets the road.
Okay.
And the source offers some really valuable insights into how to actually make that shift. They talk about the importance of vulnerability and authenticity.
Vulnerability and authenticity.
Yeah. You see, the source emphasizes that when we suppress our shadow selves, it leads to something called persona fatigue.
Persona fatigue.
Yeah. And that drains our energy and prevents us from forming genuine connections with others.
So it's like we're constantly wearing a mask, trying to present this perfect version to the world, and it just becomes exhausting.
Exactly. It's unsustainable in the long run. The source shares another really powerful anecdote about struggling with vulnerability in his own relationships.
Oh, wow.
He talks about how embracing vulnerability, even though it felt super scary at first, actually led to positive transformations in both his marriage and his business relationships. It allowed him to connect with people on a deeper level and build more meaningful relationships.
That makes so much sense. It's like we try to protect ourselves by putting up these walls, but those walls can actually end up isolating us and preventing us from experiencing true intimacy and connection.
Exactly. And this ties back to the shadow.
Okay.
The source explains that when we deny those parts of ourselves that we deem unacceptable, we create a sense of shame.
Shame.
Yeah, shame tells us, I am bad.
I am bad.
Right. It's a deeply painful emotion that keeps us stuck in this cycle of self-blame and self-sabotage. And the source makes a really important distinction here between shame and guilt.
Okay.
Guilt acknowledges that I did something bad. It focuses on our actions rather than our inherent worthiness as a person.
That's such a huge distinction. I can see how guilt can actually be a catalyst for growth because it allows us to acknowledge our mistakes and learn from them.
Right.
Whereas shame just keeps us trapped in this negative spiral.
Exactly.
So if we want to move away from shame and embrace vulnerability, how do we start to shift those negative identities that we might be holding on to?
That's a great question, and it's something the source delves into in quite a bit of detail.
Okay.
They argue that we need to become more conscious of the identities that we're choosing. Often we unconsciously identify with these negative labels like I'm stupid or I'm not good enough.
Right.
And these labels become self-fulfilling prophecies because they dictate our actions and outcomes.
So it's like those negative identities become this filter through which we view the world, and they end up shaping our experiences.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that the key is to consciously choose empowering identities that align with who we want to be. It's about recognizing that we have the power to choose our thoughts and beliefs, and that those choices ultimately will shape our reality.
This is all starting to come together now. We've talked about the shadow, identity shifting, vulnerability, and now the power of choosing our identities. It seems like all of these concepts are really interconnected, but how do we actually put this into practice? How do we actually start to work with our shadow?
So, you want to put this into practice? Well, this is where the rubber really meets the road.
Okay.
And the source actually provides a really concrete exercise.
Okay.
It's called creating a shadow document.
Yeah.
This is where the real self-discovery happens.
The shadow document. That sounds intriguing. What exactly is that?
It's like this powerful tool for bringing those hidden aspects of ourselves into the light. The source suggests that you take some time to really reflect on like the characteristics, the attitudes, the actions that you might consider negative, maybe even evil,
Okay.
And just write them down in this document, giving them space to exist without judgment.
So it's about acknowledging those parts of ourselves that we usually try to hide, even from ourselves. That could be kind of scary, huh?
It can be, absolutely. But the source emphasizes that shame thrives in secrecy and suppression.
Okay.
So by shining a light on these shadow aspects, we actually diminish their power. Just acknowledging them can be incredibly liberating.
It's like that saying, what we resist persists. So by trying to push these shadow aspects away, we might actually be giving them more power.
Exactly. And the source even shares examples from their own shadow document,
Okay.
highlighting their competitive drive and how it can manifest in both positive and negative ways.
Well, interesting.
Yeah, so they explore how that drive can be a source of motivation and achievement, but also a source of anxiety and stress if it's not managed consciously.
So it sounds like the key is to find that balance, to understand the full spectrum of our shadow's influence, without letting it completely take over.
Exactly. And the source suggests something kind of interesting, like giving your shadow self a name.
Oh, okay.
This can actually help you relate to it in a more conscious way, in like a less threatening way. It's almost like befriending that part of yourself instead of fearing it.
That's a fascinating idea. I can see how that would help create some distance and perspective. So you can observe those shadow qualities without feeling totally overwhelmed by them, right?
Right. It can also be helpful to kind of explore where those shadow qualities might have originated. Like perhaps they were developed as coping mechanisms in childhood, or maybe they're reflections of like past hurts and traumas. Understanding the root of these shadows can often soften their grip on us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like, when you understand why someone is behaving a certain way, it becomes easier to have compassion for them, even if their behavior is challenging.
Absolutely. And that compassion is crucial, especially when we're dealing with our own shadow selves. It's about recognizing that those shadow qualities were likely developed as a way to protect us, even if they're no longer serving us in the present.
This whole conversation has been so insightful. I'm starting to see how understanding our shadow selves is not about becoming a different person, but about becoming more fully who we already are.
Exactly. It's about integrating all parts of ourselves, both the light and the shadow, to become more whole and complete. And, the source points out that this integration process, it's an ongoing journey. It's not a destination. There'll always be new layers to uncover, new aspects of ourselves to explore.
So it's not about achieving some kind of perfect state of enlightenment, but more about embracing the ongoing process of self-discovery and growth.
Precisely. It's about being curious about ourselves, being willing to explore those hidden depths with courage and compassion.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. It's given me so much to think about, in terms of my own shadow self and how I can start to integrate those hidden aspects into my life in a healthy way.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, the path to true power and fulfillment begins with accepting and integrating every aspect of yourself, even the parts that you might have been hiding.
Such great advice. So, to wrap things up, what would be the most important piece of advice you would give to our listeners who are just starting to explore their own shadow selves?
I'd say be patient with yourself. This is a journey of self-discovery, and it takes time and courage to explore those hidden depths. Don't judge yourself for what you find there. Remember, your shadow self is a part of you, and it holds value valuable lessons and insights that can help you to grow and evolve.
That's such wise advice. Embrace the journey and be kind to yourself along the way. I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the shadow self. It's been a really illuminating conversation.